So it's been about a decade since I've been at Grace, and about a decade before that since I was a regular attender around here. But we had gotten in the habit of visiting once in a while. We would visit on Christmas, and Dad would sign us up to usher, and we would usher. But I remember standing in the back that Christmas night of 2005 thinking, this is probably the last time I'll be here, because I was finishing up seminary and I knew as a pastor I'd be working in other congregations where it would be my privilege to serve. It is good to be back here and to speak with you this morning. Now, the last time I preached was Youth Sunday. If I'm right, the year was 1992. There was a baptism that morning as well. I hope that it's good to be back. I don't think I'm back because Pastor found the cassette of that sermon somewhere. I don't even think he's probably got a tape player to play the cassette if he did. It's grace and mercy, and it's great to be welcomed back. The other reason I thought might be that in 1992 there was a presidential election between Bush and Clinton. It may be that we have another election between Bush and Clinton. So if in 10 or 20 years we have another election between Bush and Clinton, I might come back and visit. In 2011, I transitioned from being a reserve chaplain in the Navy to being an active duty chaplain, and I was assigned to the USS Chosin, homeported in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. I moved out there in June. Now, the ship was in a dry dock maintenance availability period, which meant we had it up out of the water on blocks, wires, and all sorts of things going on. People in the dry dock working on the other side of the ship. The whole ship was taken apart and being put back together. And they told me when I showed up, we're going to be getting out in a couple of months, doing sea trials, and by the end of the year, we're going to deploy. However, things did not go as planned, and by December, we were still hanging around Hawaii, and I was invited to preach at the local church we were participating with the Sunday after Christmas. Now, as it happens, the Admiral's chief of staff, to whom my boss reported, happened to worship with us. So after the service, he came out and shook my hand and says, "Oh, what ship are you on?" I said, "The USS Chosin, you know, the one that doesn't go to sea." It didn't occur to me that on Monday, when my captain went to the meeting with the Admiral and the chief of staff, he might mention that. So when I was asked about it later that week, I said, "Well, it's true." My captain at the time was Dave Sheridan. And as we prepared to go back to sea, he gathered some of the leaders, as we did on a regular basis, and he began to talk about the need to be vigilant as we took this ship that was taken apart and put back together to sea. Many folks like me had shown up in the interim and hadn't been to sea on this ship. We didn't know what normal was. We didn't know how to tie things down so they didn't go flying when the waves came rolling. So he told us the story when he was the commanding officer on the USS Milius. They had done a maintenance availability. They had gone to sea to test the ship. And then they suffered a series of engineering casualties. Things had not been put back together right. Folks had not quite paid enough attention. And casualty after casualty, and there was oil and fuel in the water, and it was a bad day. But they recovered, and they stopped the casualties, and they still had propulsion. And the captain made one of those not-so-fun phone calls to the Admiral. "Sir, we've had some problems. We'd like to come back in." "Well, can you promise me that you won't put any oil in the harbor?" "No, sir." Click. It says it was about 24 hours later that he got a call back telling them they could come in. Now, I tell that story this morning to help us begin to think about what it is to tell truth to power. When we get caught with cookie crumbs and Mom asks, "Who ate the cookies?" When we have to call the Admiral and they ask for promises that we can't make, do we stand up and tell the truth? See, as I was thinking about Thomas, it seems to me that he's a lot like the good captain. I know that if you open your dictionary to Doubting Thomas, it will tell you that Thomas is famous for his doubt, and a doubting Thomas is someone who's skeptical and doesn't believe. But I think Thomas wasn't really a doubter. I think Thomas was that guy. You know the type. You're in the boardroom at work or the committee meeting at church, and everybody's looking for the easy solution, the cheaper solution, and Thomas says, "No, if we want to do this right, it's going to take longer and cost more. If we want to do it the right way, it's It's going to be more inconvenient and more challenging. Or at the end of the meeting when we're all checking our watches and we're getting ready to go home, the game has started. Thomas says, wait a minute, I don't understand. Can I ask another question? And if the answer doesn't make sense, Thomas says, no, I'm sorry. Can you go on a little bit longer? I didn't quite get what you said. Maybe you know someone a little like that. Now, our three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they mention Thomas by name, but not much else. It's in the gospel according to John that Thomas gets a few more lines. In fact, there are three stories that we read about him. The first story is a story that's also only in the gospel according to John. It's the story of Lazarus. Jesus and his disciples are hanging out, and they get word that Lazarus is sick, and they hang out for a few more days. And then Jesus says, hey, let's go to Judea to visit Lazarus so that God's glory might be revealed. And the disciples say, Jesus, last time we were in Judea, they were trying to stone you. They wanted to kill you. You sure you want to go back to Judea? Jesus says, I'm going to Judea. Now, the text doesn't tell us what happened there, but you get the sense that the disciples were thinking, hey, maybe we'll stay here and wait for you to come back. Because it tells us that Thomas says, let's go so that we can die with him. Thomas chooses the difficult way. He does not look for the path of least resistance. He sounds like those Marines who might use a little more colorful language than we would on Sundays, but would turn to their comrades and say, what, are you afraid to die? Let's go do this. The next time we meet Thomas is at the Last Supper, the final Passover. They've eaten. Jesus has invited Judas to go and do what he must do. And he starts to talk to his disciples. But before he gets into the full sermon, full monologue, there's interaction with the disciples. Simon Peter pipes up, and Philip, and Judas, and Thomas. Jesus talks about going away, and Simon Peter says, hey, where are you going? Can I go with you? And we get Jesus' prediction of Peter's denials. And then Jesus goes on talking about where he's going, and Thomas says, wait a minute, Jesus, where are you going? I don't think you answered Peter's question. And then we get that famous line from Jesus, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Philip asks to see the Father. And Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And then he goes on a little more. And the other Judas says, well, Jesus, are you just going to reveal yourself to us or to everyone? And Jesus promises that the Spirit is coming and there will be an inclusivity that will be amazing and wonderful. And then Jesus continues to teach for a while, and the disciples are quiet until Jesus has been teaching for a while, and the disciples start to get restless and engage him once again. The next and final time that Thomas appears is the infamous story we read today. And I hope that having told those other two stories, we start to think about Thomas a little differently. Thomas is prepared to go and die with Jesus. When Jesus doesn't answer the question, Thomas is willing to say, hey, Jesus, wait a minute. Don't give us the political answer. What's the right answer? We didn't catch that. And now when the disciples say, hey, we've seen the risen Lord, Thomas says, I need a little more. It's like the banker who you want to give you money. They may believe you're trustworthy, but they're going to want documents and proof of your creditworthiness and your lack of indebtedness. It's like the scientist who's doing research on a drug that might save lives, and it may look like it could work, but all the anecdotal evidence in the world doesn't count as scientific proof. And they're going to wait until they're sure that this is safe and this will work. Thomas is like that guy who says, I don't want to invalidate your belief, but that's not my belief. We'll return to this idea of belief and faith in just a minute. We should point out that Thomas continues to be that guy for us today. Every year around Easter, the news media explodes with salacious headlines about things we didn't know about Jesus. CNN had their special this year, as did NBC, and parts of the headlines and things are, oh, this lost and secret thing. And every once in a while, the Gospel of Thomas is one of those headlines. They want the ratings. The truth is, the Gospel of Thomas has been around for quite some time, and we aren't surprised by it. Yes, it may make some of us uncomfortable. How does it relate to our other Gospels, the ones we have in our Bible? Sometimes it says the same thing, sometimes a little different. How should we interact with it? We have to deal with it, and Thomas is that guy. Then there's this other text we have. We call it the Acts of Thomas. It tells us how Thomas went to India to spread the gospel. Now, some debate whether it's fiction or nonfiction, or how to parse out the real and imaginary. What we know is that hundreds of years later, they found evidence of Christianity in India. And if you read it, it sounds like Thomas. So the disciples are casting lots to see who goes where to spread the gospel. And they cast lots, and Thomas gets India, and Thomas says, "No thanks. India's not good for me. I won't do well in India, so somebody else go." So the story tells us that Jesus shows up and says, "Thomas, I need you to go to India." And Thomas says, "No thanks. I don't want to go to India. Sorry." So Jesus says, "Okay." And the story tells us that Jesus goes out and finds an Indian who happens to be in town and says, "Hey, I'm going to sell you this guy as a slave." And so he sells Thomas, and Thomas, guy comes over and says, "Hey, this Jesus guy just sold you to me." So Thomas goes, "Oh, all right. Well, Jesus, I'll go where you want me to go. I'll do what you want me to do. But, let's keep it difficult. Let's do it the hard way." Only Thomas. Now, I hear that around here you're working through sermons that keep reflecting on the ideas of belonging, behaving, and believing. And here we are talking about Thomas, who's at least a misbehavior and an unbeliever. But Thomas is faithful. And Thomas belongs. And it's good to remind ourselves of his faithfulness in the face of his rough edges. Almost 3 decades ago, I sat in confirmation classes in the basement of this church. It was in that classroom that I first began to learn that grace was more than the name of our church. It's the radical way in which God intervenes in our lives to redeem us. I've learned and never forgotten that we are saved in spite of ourselves, in spite of our failures, and in spite of our successes. Now, Thomas didn't go straight away to India. He did not accept the word of his fellow disciples. I like Thomas. I understand him. I didn't go straight from those confirmation classes to ministry. It took me 20 years of meandering and wandering, and I even changed jerseys a couple times along the way as I tried to figure out where I belonged. Somewhere along the way, I came across the theologian Paul Tillich. He has been one I have read more than any others and reread time and again. And I mention him this morning because he, more than any others, taught us with crystal clarity that faith is not opposed to doubt. Faith takes up belief and doubt into its very fabric. To be faithful is to have doubts. To be without doubt is to succumb to a totalitarian ideology that won't even change in the face of reality. To have faith is to live with answers and questions, doubts and certainty. It's to recognize that even when Thomas didn't behave, even when Thomas didn't believe, he belonged. Each year as we come back and tell this story of Thomas on the Sunday after Easter, I like him more and more. See, he reminds me of another lesson I learned in that confirmation class almost 3 decades ago. God uses people like Thomas. God uses people who don't get it right. From Abraham, Gideon, and Samuel, to the apostles Peter, Paul, and yes, the Apostle Thomas. Down through the centuries to folks like Martin Luther and John Wesley, to today. And it's today that we start to get a little excited, because in those names of misbehaviors and unbelievers who get included among the faithful, who are told that they belong, they're writing your name. And yes, I believe they're writing my name too. Amen.